I think one of the most striking things to me about the climate change policy debate is that I'm hard-pressed to think of another policy area where there have been so many big ideas, so many good ideas, such strong advice from the experts that has been at best ignored and at worst completely rejected. Scientists agree on the causes of climate change and that we need to urgently act starting now to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels if we're to avoid dangerous interference with the global climate. The slide that Tom showed us. There's no shortage of good ideas from engineers. We may not have all the technologies we need, but we've got lots of good ones that are sitting around on the shelves, and we have no shortage of ingenuity. Economists and other policy analysts agree on a clear policy solution, which is to put a price on carbon, whether via cap and trade, a carbon tax, some combination of the two. That'll spur further ingenuity among the engineering communities. It'll save us a lot of money. But policymakers are ignoring or rejecting all of that advice. And alas, I feel like my own discipline, political science, has equally strong consensus in explaining why we've been failing so miserably to adopt more effective climate change policies. It's a collective action problem on a global scale, so it's very hard for almost 200 countries to get their act together. At the electoral level, voters are for the most part affected a small amount rather relative to other much more immediate issues for the average person, and therefore they're rationally ill-informed and inattentive. Climate change presents big winners and losers, and in politics, the losers are almost always more aware and better organized. And finally, our political institutions are ill-suited to a challenge of this magnitude. In Canada, our electoral system encourages appeals to the middle-of-the-road voter, that person who is most inattentive to climate change. The fact that we have elections every 4 years makes it very difficult to make long-term investments. And I'd argue somewhat more pessimistically than those who've spoken so far today that our federal system has, on balance, been a deterrent to action, particularly in light of provincial government's ownership of fossil fuels in the Canadian Federation and our ingrained, if somewhat misguided, expectation that Canadian politics demands federal-provincial consensus. Overcoming all of that is a very tall order, and I don't have any magic bullet, no single big idea to propose. What I'm increasingly trying to do in my own research is to identify places where good things are happening and to try derive lessons about where are the points of leverage, because I think we'll need all of those points of leverage given the magnitude of this problem. So what I'd like to do in the remaining time is offer 3 ideas for a new kind of climate change politics that is, first, more personal, second, more future-oriented, and third, more courageous. So starting with the personal, just a couple days ago, I read an online article, I think it was maybe in the Huffington Post, in which Joe Oliver was quoted as saying that pipelines are about as exciting as watching paint dry. Well, none of my fellow British Columbians, nor I suspect Joe Oliver, would agree with that statement today. Politics in British Columbia, my home province, is increasingly a battle over proposed infrastructure to export fossil fuels. 2 pipelines, Enbridge Northern Gateway and the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain expansion, that are highly contentious proposals to get Alberta's bitumen to BC's coast, a push by the British Columbia government to dramatically expand production from unconventional natural gas sources and for construction of LNG terminals along the coast, again for export, and finally a struggle that is emerging alongside those in British Columbia, but also in Oregon and Washington, fighting proposed coal terminals. And there the issue is that the U.S. has reduced its reliance on thermal coal for electricity production, and so those coal miners in Wyoming are eager to get their surplus out of the U.S. and on to Asia through coastal jurisdictions in Canada and the U.S. Now, I will admit that as a policy analyst, I have been very skeptical about these project-by-project battles. After all, we need an economy-wide price on carbon, and stopping one pipeline or one coal port or one LNG terminal isn't going to solve our problems. I've also been very uncomfortable with the almost exclusive focus in those debates on local impacts. Opponents of pipelines in British Columbia invariably lead with the prospect of oil spills on our beloved coast. LNG opponents emphasize local impacts from fracking, potential groundwater contamination, for instance, and opponents of coal exports emphasize coal dust and diesel exhaust that are released along the rail lines. And don't get me wrong, I think these are perfectly understandable concerns, and those are the ones that I'd be focused on if I lived beside those railroad tracks. But I've been uneasy that we haven't been talking nearly so much about the environmental disaster that will ensue if everything goes right. The tankers don't run aground, the groundwater isn't contaminated in fracking, the coal dust is contained, and all of those growing quantities of fossil fuels safely make it to markets and are used as intended. If we only focus on the local, there's a risk that we won't build support for the kinds of actions that are needed to address climate change. Indeed, it could backfire if we create a public perception that the problem is not burning fossil fuels, but safely transporting them. So all that said, I've become increasingly hopeful that these campaigns are the first steps towards a more promising politics to address climate change. And a few reasons for that. The first is that there are very good reasons to focus on infrastructure proposals, even if we haven't got national carbon pricing down. First of all, it's going in the wrong direction to increase our production of fossil fuels when we need so urgently to be reducing our national and global reliance on those fuels. It's locking capital into fossil fuel investments that will last many decades rather than moving that capital towards cleaner energy. And finally, and I think often underestimated, is how that locks us in politically. No politician ever shuts down a facility once it's already built. Indeed, they tend to prop them up long past their intended lives with weak standards, lax of enforcement, and when all else fails, subsidies to keep dirty operations going. The other reason that I'm optimistic about these campaigns is that I think there's a possibility of connecting local concerns to a greater awareness of the global problem. The challenge of climate change is that it's so abstract to the average person, but these local fights are tangible and they're personal, and people are very passionate about them. And I think communities are just starting to connect the dots. Northern and southern communities in British Columbia, Aboriginal communities in Alberta, with coastal communities in BC. It's not a very big leap for Vancouverites who are concerned about coal dust in their local communities to relate to the downstream impacts when that coal gets burned in China, because after all, many Vancouverites don masks when they go back to visit their relatives in China on an annual basis. So I'm becoming more open to what might be called NIMBY politics, at least as a first step. We've tended to see NIMBY as a bad thing, the premise being that communities are saying no to necessary projects that are in the national public interest. But I think in this case, communities may be doing us a favor by engaging personally with these issues and starting to say no. So that's the more personal politics. A second thought is how we could achieve a more future-oriented politics. The challenge of climate change is not only that there are winners and losers, but that the losers are today and the winners are in the future. In seeking to launch that transition that James was talking about away from our non-sustainable status quo, those who are most threatened know who they are and actively oppose change, and those who will benefit the most from that low-carbon economy don't know who they are. They don't know that it's their jobs that they should be fighting for. And the more carbon-intensive the economy, the harder that is. And we see that, I think, very strongly in Canadian politics. So how do we create a lobby for a low-carbon future? Like many academics, I put my faith in markets. There's lots of reasons to expect that if we put a price on carbon, markets will respond. But that's a really feeble political argument. No one gets elected by saying, I know this looks bad for you, but trust me, it'll work out. So let me suggest a couple possibilities. One is to create more concrete narratives about job creation in the transition to a low-carbon economy. And I want to make a nod here to Sephora Berman, who's out there, because we had a great conversation in the YVR lounge yesterday about this very topic. Yes, we need to create this long-term vision of sustainable communities where people can walk and they're connected to their neighbors, but in the short term, we need to show how jobs will be created here and now. We need to show what we're saying yes to as well as what we're saying no to. The second idea I have about creating this lobby for the future is to encourage and amplify the voices of youth. And that's not a small task because youth are either too young to vote, or if they're old enough to vote, they're not doing it. But I think there are voices for generational change that are out there, and they have an increasingly powerful message. The message I hear them saying, my students, my own kids, is that either we think the world will get its act together on climate change, in which case we're saddling them with an outdated economy, or we're betting on the world not getting its act together, in which case our generation is choosing to make a lot of money at their expense. The divestment movement that has taken off across North America in a very short time, I think, is an emerging lobby for a low-carbon future. And the power of that campaign for me lies not in the specifics of their call for universities to divest from fossil fuels, but in the very fact of today's youth speaking up for their future interests. So I think they are the potential lobby for those low-carbon future jobs. They're the people who want those jobs, and we need to find ways to amplify their voices. And finally, a more courageous politics. So far I've been talking about bottom-up, and there's lots of evidence that in countries where there's greater salience among voters, there's stronger action, but that's not the only source of policy change. Let me offer 3 examples of leadership that can make a difference. The first, 2 examples, given the time. The first is British Columbia's adoption of a revenue-neutral carbon tax, and this was very much Premier Gordon Campbell's baby. One of the things about our Westminster system is it tends to concentrate authority in a very small number of hands, and especially the hands of the Premier or the Prime Minister. That can be used to weaken environmental policies, as we've seen at the federal level, but it can also be used to adopt bold policies. And adopting a carbon tax didn't actually require Gordon Campbell to fall on his sword. That came later. It did require that the provincial government take a chance when a window of opportunity for leadership opened up. Campbell was leading a government with a comfortable majority, and it also helped that his was the party on the right which had the confidence of the business community. So there was a real Nixon goes to China element to leadership in the BC case, as I would argue there has been in Arnold Schwarzenegger's leadership in getting a cap-and-trade program off the ground in California. One of the other really striking things about the BC experience is that the politics of adoption of a new carbon tax are very different than the politics of maintaining that tax over time. When the sky didn't fall, voters stopped paying attention to the carbon tax and went back to thinking it was a good idea. And in fact, public support for the carbon tax rebounded. Public support increased even as the price on carbon was increasing and as the carbon tax was starting to work to decrease fuel consumption. Even the business community now, although it doesn't want further increases, supports maintaining the tax because the alternative would be to go back to increasing corporate and individual income taxes. So yes, we need some gutsy leadership, but the risks can be mitigated with smart timing and policy design. My second example is from Germany. I'm not an expert on this, but in the late 1980s, I'm struck that when climate change first reached the public agenda in Germany, one of the first things that was done was creation of a committee that comprised equal parts scientists and elected officials from all political parties. And there's a couple consequences of that. One is that there has been much less questioning of climate change science in Germany, but the other is that it is a less partisan issue. Of course, that's facilitated by a proportional representation electoral system, which leads to the emergence of smaller parties, need for coalition governments. In contrast, Canada's Westminster system creates disincentives for parties to collaborate. And unfortunately, in the 2008 federal campaign, we saw all too painfully how easy it is to score partisan points by taking advantage of public ignorance and misunderstanding when it comes to climate change. One option is for Green voters to coordinate themselves so they increase their impact in competitive ridings. But at the end of the day, and I am concluding, and however Pollyanna-ish this sounds, and believe me, I'm a political scientist, so I get how Pollyanna-ish this is, I still hold out hope for some measure of cooperation across Canada's political parties, because the leaders of our parties are the ones who can create change most immediately, and they're the ones who will ultimately be held to account if we continue on this path of quite profound policy failure. Thank you.